The forest had always spoken in murmurs. Wind through pine, the soft shuffling of deer, the sharp call of hawks wheeling overhead. Lately it had gone silent. No birds, no insects, just a breathless stillness, as if the trees themselves were holding something in. Jared Beck noticed it before anyone else. But then again, no one else lived out here, not this deep. 10 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by dense Washington wilderness, Beck had made peace with solitude long ago. It was the only place where the world left him alone. Beck was a man carved by wars, shaped by survival. He didn't speak much, but he listened to trees, the soil, to the vibrations carried through moss-covered roots. That week, the forest had been whispering warnings he couldn't ignore. He first saw the light on a Thursday night. A flicker high up in the canopy, cold and blue, like moonlight caught in motion. It moved, darted between the trees, and then vanished. Not the steady drone of a drone, not a bird, not lightning. Beck didn't believe in UFOs, but he did believe in pattern disruption, and that was enough. At dawn, he climbed one of the taller cedars using old climbing gear and his own hard-earned familiarity with vertigo. From the treetop, he scanned the horizon with a scope, infrared and motion-sensitive. In the distance, he caught it. A series of heat signatures clustered unnaturally across a ridge. They weren't mammals. Too still, too cold in shape. They pulsed faintly, as if exhaling. Beck didn't descend right away. He watched for hours, ignoring the cramp in his thighs and the sting of sweat. Something was up there. Several somethings. And they didn't belong. By nightfall, he moved in closer. Stealth came naturally. A decade in the Army's long shadows taught him how to become terrain. Mud across the skin, a slow crawl through underbrush, movement in sync with the wind. He reached the base of the ridge and looked up. The trees were littered with unnatural growths, slick, pod-like structures affixed to branches, pulsing with a slow bioluminescence. They hummed at a frequency he felt more than heard. Then he saw one. It hung upside down from a branch 20 feet above, limbs wrapped around bark with impossible articulation. Tall and sinewy, like a stretched insect, its skin shimmered with a hue that bent into its surroundings, a camouflage so perfect it vanished unless it moved. Its head was narrow, triangular, with slits for eyes that scanned the dark. It was watching, listening. Beck did not breathe. The creature made a clicking noise, a burst of short pulses, then leapt silently to another tree, weightless as shadow. It joined two others, their forms barely visible against the foliage. They conferred in a series of gestures and digital warbles. He crept back, heart hammering against his ribs, not because of fear, not entirely. It was a realization, the clarity, that these weren't explorers. They weren't lost. They were scouts. Back in his cabin, Beck replayed the images he'd captured through a scope. He ran spectral analysis, isolating the alien tech's energy signature. In the background noise of their chatter, he isolated a data stream, compressed communication, layered over frequency bursts. Not language, exactly. Code. He'd done enough Black Ops recon in hostile foreign cyberspace to know encryption when he saw it. And something in it, something in the phrasing of the signals, suggested more were coming. These weren't random visitors. They were mapping, measuring, preparing. He leaned back in his chair, watching the code flicker across the screen. His fingers tapped the desk. For a moment, the forest outside seemed to pulse in time with the alien rhythm. They had come here quietly. They thought Earth wouldn't notice. They thought no one was watching. He stood and opened the locked chest beneath the floorboards. Inside were remnants of his old life, a carbon steel survival knife, field rations, a modded longbow with broadhead arrows, a heavily altered comm scanner. He laid them out one by one, methodically, reverently. A single wolf howled in the distance. It didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a challenge. Beck smiled for the first time in weeks. The next morning, he followed the scent of scorched sap and ionized air. He found a trail, not on the ground, but up in the trees. Scratches too clean for claws, too wide for squirrels. Residual heat still clung to the branches. They thought the trees would hide them. They didn't know someone had been raised in those same trees. Someone who knew how to move through them like smoke, how to kill from them like a ghost. He spent the afternoon rigging climbing lines, redistributing old sensor nodes he'd embedded in the canopy years ago. The forest was his grid now. Every tree, every branch, mapped and cataloged. He'd know where they were before they knew he was watching. That night, he returned to the ridge. This time he climbed. From one tree to the next, silent as frost, he closed the distance between them. The aliens were gathered around a device, part mechanical, part organic, buried shallowly beneath a twisted root. One of them fed it a pellet of gray material, which dissolved with a hiss. The device pulsed green. Beck's heart sank. This wasn't scouting. This was terraforming, and they were seeding more than ground. He pulled back and whispered into his recorder, voice barely audible. Multiple targets confirmed. Arboreal infiltration. Non-human. Invasive behavior. Tech suggests forward incursion team. Acting independently. No government response. I'm initiating containment. He clicked the recorder off and took a long look at the treetops. There were 7 of them. Maybe 8. More than he'd expected. Didn't matter. They'd chosen the wrong forest. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield. Beck moved through it like a revenant. Silent and relentless, a man shaped by war and wilderness. He had once fought enemies that wore uniforms and carried flags. Now he hunted something stranger, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The alien scouts didn't leave footprints. They passed like shadows through canopy, their bodies absorbing and reflecting the forest light, rendering them almost invisible. But Beck didn't need to see them to know where they were. He read broken lichen, followed the minute shifts in birdsong, what little remained, and trusted the oldest instincts in his blood. He laid the first trap by the ridge, where one of the scouts had deployed a black pod between 2 fir trees. A tension snare made from carbon thread wires stretched invisibly between the trunks, rigged with a crude pressure spike designed to trigger upward through soft underarmor. He wasn't sure it would kill, but it would send a message. The wait was long. He stayed prone in a low hollow beneath the roots of a wind-fallen tree, covered in forest duff and soaked through from evening mist. Time moved differently when you were hunting. Every snapped twig, every errant rustle threatened to shatter the silence like glass. Then movement, a figure detached from the darkness, a ripple in the texture of air. The scout moved lightly, almost reverently, its long limbs adjusting with careful geometry. It stepped through the trap, and the wires snapped tight with a soft twang. The creature spasmed, high-pitched pulses spilling from its throat as the spike drove upward through its leg into the thoracic cavity. It thrashed violently for a few seconds, then collapsed in a heap of unnatural angles. Beck waited. He didn't trust it was dead until its skin lost its reactive shimmer and dulled to a sickly gray-blue. He approached slowly, bow drawn, arrow nocked. The creature's breathing had stopped. There was blood, if it could be called that, seeping out from the wound, almost crystalline in the dim light. He crouched beside it and studied the body. The armor was grown, not forged. Organic panels flowed over joints and muscle, adjusting even in death. The face was expressionless, but something in its posture, its final curl, felt almost human. That didn't stop Beck from severing the head and carrying it high into branches. He hunted there with a length of snare wire, letting it spin slowly in the breeze. A warning, a declaration. The following night, they came looking. 3 of them, spread in a wide arc, scanning the terrain with insectal devices that chirped and clicked as they passed. Beck had expected this. He lured them into a false clearing, one lined with broken branches and disrupted foliage, a scene stage to suggest a skirmish. He positioned himself upslope, flanked by thorny underbrush and armed with a bow. The first arrow hit center mass. The scout staggered but didn't fall. The second arrow pierced its throat. That did the job. The others scattered, faster than any human could move. One sprinted straight up the trunk of a tree, disappearing into the canopy. The third fled back toward their base camp, clicking out bursts of code as it ran. Beck retrieved the body, but left the other 2. Let them report back. Let them speak of the ghosts who moved with the trees. Days passed. Tensions rose. The forest, once theirs, now betrayed them. Their scanners began failing. Their pod structures withered, deactivated by sabotage and stolen components. Beck didn't understand their tech, but he didn't have to. He pulled enough to make their systems unreliable. He stole something every night, a sensor node, a nutrient coil, a comms relay, and left another skull in its place. By the fifth kill, their patrols had changed. No more scouting. No more experiments. They were defending now, and afraid. One evening, Beck watched from a high perch as two scouts circled a ravaged pod site. They moved erratically, scanning everything, their postures twitchy, reactive. One kept glancing into the trees, searching for motion. The other stumbled, distracted, and barked something guttural at his partner. They were unraveling. Beck almost pitted them. Almost. He crafted new traps that week. Vertical snares meant to hoist targets into the air, and drop traps that used weighted stones and carved wooden stakes. He reverted to primal methods, not out of desperation, but because the forest offered its own solutions. It was an ecosystem older than their technology, and Beck had learned its language. Each trap took a life. He stopped collecting the heads. The message had already been written, lettered in blood and fear and silence. Now it was about ending it, one by one. But they weren't just dying. They were adapting. On the seventh day, Beck was moving along a narrow ravine when a metallic click froze him mid-step. A trap, not his. He dropped to his knees as a bolt of searing energy hissed over his back and scorched the tree behind him. He rolled, drew his blade, and came up facing one of them, smaller than the others, leaner, faster. It darted forward, claws outstretched. They fought. It wasn't graceful. It was violent, raw, and without rhythm. Beck took a slash to the shoulder, but buried his knife deep under the creature's arm. They collapsed together, blood and bark and breath mixing into one heaving mass. When it stopped twitching, he sat back, panting. They were learning, but so was he. By nightfall, he had patched the wound with coagulant moss and alcohol. It burned like hell, but it held. He didn't sleep. He listened to the wind and the way it shifted. They would come again, and when they did, the forest would be ready. A cluster of data flickered through the alien's ocular interface. Heat patterns, kinetic vectors, biochemical stress signatures. The forest screamed in its own way, and the scouts had begun to understand. Something here hunted them. Zartel clung to the boughs of an ancient pine, his limbs quivering not from exhaustion, but something else, an emotion their kind rarely acknowledged, unease. The others were scattered now. Two had gone silent, their signal flares never triggered, their biosensors dead. The canopy, once a perfect shroud, had become a labyrinth of traps and death. They had landed expecting prey. What they had found instead was something ancient and territorial, something clever. Beck moved beneath them, invisible to all but the wind. He'd learned their movements, how they rotated watch shifts and triads, how their vision faltered in infrared when exposed to overcharged chlorophyll blooms. He didn't need to understand their biology. He needed only the rhythms. And once he'd learned those, the killing had become easier, not effortless, but easier. He waited until twilight bled into the branches, then struck. The alien he targeted was alone, checking a perimeter beacon that had gone dark hours ago. It leaned forward to inspect the pod, and Beck dropped from above like a felled hawk. His knife found the gap between cervical armor and cranial plating with surgical precision. One twist, a quiet spasm, then stillness. He hauled the body upward by a vine and left it suspended between two trees, draped and skeletal like a warning to gods. They would find in the morning, dangling above their tech like an omen. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't just tactics, it was theater. They were a species of logic and metrics. Fear wasn't in their native tongue. He was teaching it to them, one corpse at a time. By the third kill, they had changed. Less movement, tighter formations, increased scanning. Beck watched them from afar, unseen behind his camouflage net strung with moss and lichen. They had erected a defensive ring, surrounded by sensor pulses and perimeter drones. But it was too late. They had lost the forest. At night, he moved among their pods, studying their equipment. The bio-sculpted tech was unlike anything he'd seen, but familiar in its intention. Communication, energy distribution, terrain manipulation. One device emitted short pulses into the soil, terraforming, he assumed. Another mapped root structures and transmitted real-time growth simulations. The aliens weren't just observing. They were preparing to overwrite the ecosystem. He collected a piece of their equipment, a shattered node from a second ambush, and brought it back to the cabin. Inside, under a red lamp and a jury-rig microscope, he dismantled it. The material resisted standard tools. It wasn't metal, not in the traditional sense, more like hardened resin laced with living filaments. It reacted subtly to heat and pulse, twitching beneath his fingers like a muscle unsure if it was still alive. What disturbed him most wasn't the tech's design. It was the scale of intention behind it. These weren't lone agents. They were part of a larger mechanism, a system, a plan. The realization took root in his chest like ice. This forest was a test site. The next day confirmed it. He found a map etched into a pod's internal panel, an anatomical diagram of the region's biome, marked with nodes, paths, and zone designations. It wasn't exploratory. It was procedural. They weren't adapting to the terrain. They were rewriting it. He crushed the device under his boot and let the shattered pieces sink into the loam. Later, as he patrolled the southern slope, Beck stumbled upon something new. A body, but not one of theirs. It was human, half buried under moss and crumpled ferns. The corpse had been discarded carelessly. A camper or hiker, maybe, dragged off from a trail and used, dissected, cataloged, forgotten. Beck crouched beside the body, rage pooling in his stomach. The man couldn't have been more than 20. A backpack still slung over one arm, face frozen in a scream. This changed everything. It wasn't just Earth they meant to claim. It was dominance by attrition, eradication of native species to make room for their own. Humanity wasn't being studied. It was being phased out. That night, Beck didn't set traps. He set fires. He soaked the ridge base in pine sap and oil, lit a slow fuse, and vanished into the darkness. The flames licked the trees with orange tongues, driving up smoke that danced between the branches. The aliens responded with panic, darting from their roosts like hornets from a broken nest. One tried to extinguish the blaze with a strange liquid dispenser. It exploded under a broadhead arrow from Beck's bow. They retreated further into the canopy, abandoning 3 of their pods and several relay points. Beck didn't chase them. He watched the fire do what it was born to do, cleanse. The next morning, the forest was quiet again, but not dead. The silence wasn't from fear this time. It was waiting. He stood at the base of a blackened pine and watched the crows settle on a high branch. It called once, loud and shrill, then flew away. Somewhere behind him, a branch snapped. They weren't gone. They were regrouping. And this time they knew his name. The storm broke just after midnight, tearing across the ridgelines in sheets of rain and fury. Lightning shattered the sky, and thunder rolled so loud it shook the bones of the forest. Beck stood at the edge of a burned clearing, water dripping from his hood. The boughs slung across his back wet but intact. Ash washed in rivulets around his boots. The fire he'd started days ago had blackened this place, but not ended the fight. Not yet. The aliens were quieter now, smarter. Each move Beck made was mirrored by subtler countermeasures. Sensor webs retracted from easy sabotage. Patrol routes staggered with unpredictable pauses. They'd begun to see him not as an animal, not even as an enemy, but as something more dangerous. A peer. He welcomed that. It was in the silence between thunderclaps that he spotted the shimmer, just the faintest curve of light where there should have been none. Clinging to the bark 20 meters ahead, one of the scouts, nearly indistinguishable from the trunk it melded with. Watching, waiting. Beck didn't approach. He studied it from the shelter of a rock outcrop, eyes narrowed. This scout didn't fidget like the others. It didn't scan the terrain in broad sweeps. It was still, purposeful, and listening with something more than sensors. Instinct. It felt familiar. He marked it, then slipped away. By morning, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. Beck ascended the northeast slope and reached the overlook, his eyes scanning the valley through a battered scope. Most of the pods lay dormant now, drained of whatever alien bioenergy they fed on. But something new glinted through the mist on the far rise. Spires. Sharp, deliberate, unnatural, a new structure. He adjusted the focus. The design was angular and faceted like obsidian, its surface broken by soft pulses of blue light. Vines, living cables really, descended into the earth from its base, feeding into the surrounding root systems like veins threading through flesh. A beacon. It wasn't for communication within their team. No, this one was pointed upward, calling something else. The thought sent a cold ripple down his spine. Reinforcements? A transport ship? Worse? Whatever it was, it had to be stopped. He calculated the route. Roughly 2 kilometers through tangled terrain, with at least 3 alien sensor fields along the way. He couldn't rely on speed. He'd have to be precise. Surgical. By midday, he was moving. Low and slow. Rain kept his scent dispersed. Mud muted his steps. He passed an old campsite, burned out and forgotten, where a crumpled tent still clung to the frame. A discarded backpack lay nearby, half buried. Human. Recent. Another silent name added to the dead. He pressed on, stomach coiled in a knot. As the beacon neared, he could feel it, not just through sound or vibration, but something deeper, a frequency that echoed in his jawbone, too low for ears to register. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive. He crept into position behind a thicket of twisted firs and studied the site. 3 scouts. One worked the main console, talons adjusting crystalline panels that seemed to float above the spire. Another was on its knees, feeding something into the base. Organic matter, maybe nutrients, maybe something darker. The third circled the perimeter, its movements clipped and deliberate. Beck prepared the arrow barbed, with an explosive tip wrapped in a compressed phosphorus charge. He knocked it, exhaled slowly, and let the wind settle, then fired. The arrow struck the base of the spire with a hard crack. The impact bloomed white-hot, sending the top of the beacon shattering in a fountain of sparks and alien ichor. The scout nearest the device was thrown back, its body limp before it hit the ground. The other 2 snapped to attention, scanning. But Beck was already moving. He bolted uphill through the smoke, drawing them with him. A flash charge went off behind him, a brilliant burst of light and heat. When they hesitated, confused and blinded, he veered left, back toward the beacon. The smoke masked his movement, and within moments he stood at the base again, knife in hand, eyes burning. The beacon sparked wildly, tried to repair itself. Beck didn't give it the chance. He tore into the living cables, slashing and yanking, stabbing deep into the pulsing core until its light guttered. A final shriek burst from the spire, high-pitched and alien, like a death rattle broadcast across dimensions. Silence followed, then movement. One of the scouts reappeared, dripping from the trees like a wraith. It landed with a hiss, claws flashing. Beck barely parried the first strike, the impact numbing his forearm. He countered with a sweeping cut to the creature's abdomen, drawing thick, dark blood. They circled. Beck limped. His ankle had twisted in the sprint, but his grip was steady. The scout lunged again, and this time he let it come close. Too close. He drove his blade upward into its thorax, under the arm, twisting until the creature spasmed and fell. Another shape emerged from the smoke. A second scout, different from the others. Its skin darker, almost matte, and its eyes glowing faintly. It didn't attack. It studied him. Beck raised his weapon, blood dripping from his hands. The scout stepped back. A slow, deliberate gesture. It looked past him at the broken beacon, the ruined tech, the scattered remains of its fallen. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. He stood there for a long time, rain running down his face, steam rising from the broken spire. His hands ached. His body trembled. But something had shifted. He'd stopped them from calling home. For now, the war wasn't over. Not yet, but it had changed. He had changed. The forest would remember, and so would they.